Hi, my name is Lucero, and today I will be going over the American Revolution and the key events that ultimately led to and influenced the beginning of colonial rebellion in the late 1700s. To begin, I'll go over what the American Revolution was. So, for starters, it was a political conflict between the American colonists and the British Parliament and the King. Government in the New World was generally controlled by the King and Parliament, including important administration over foreign affairs and trade. Due to the heavy and overwhelming British takeover of the American colonies, colonists became enraged and fought back for their independence. The American Revolution was set off starting in April of 1775 and ending in 1783, 8 years later. However, colonists dealt with the poor treatment from British for years before even fighting back. A few of the events that led up to it that I'll be talking about include the French and Indian War, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the First and Second Continental Congresses, and the Battle of Lexington and Concord. To begin is the French and Indian War, also known as the Seven Years' War, that began in 1754 and ended in 1763. This was a war fought between the French and the British over land disputes in northern American territories. Ultimately, the British won and gained much control and expanded their power westward into the colonies. After the war, the debt dispute was settled, and the king and the parliament ended up paying for the war. However, soon after, they decided that the colonies should be the ones paying for it, so they imposed a series of taxes as a result. This taxation ultimately started a cycle of conflict and unfair treatment between the British government and the colonies. This brings us to the next event that sparked the American Revolution, called the Stamp Act of 1765. A form of tax that British placed in order to pay for the war caused the colonies to pay tax on papers, documents, playing cards, and really anything in general that was paper. While Parliament has the power and the right to regulate colonial trade, it does not have the power to tax, since this occurred without any consent or approval of any of the colonial legislation. The phrase no taxation without representation was established by the colonies to protest the fact that they had zero representation in Parliament. Despite the colonies' effort to pressure the abolishment of the Stamp Act, Parliament issued more laws to reinstate that the king had full legislation over them. The legislation of the power the king had over the colonies persisted, and more taxes and laws were established on the colonies. Of these acts were the Townshend Acts of 1767. These acts began in 1767. It was a series of five acts that placed heavy taxes in order to not only pay off the debt of the Seven Years' War, but also pay the British soldiers that were now stationed in North American colonies. Briefly, the New York Restraining Act limited New York's ability to govern and pass new legislation of their own colony. The Revenue Act placed taxes on items, punished smugglers, and invaded privacy in order to search homes under the writs of assistance. The Indemnity Act reduced taxes on tea from the East India Company. The Commissioners of Customs Act created a five-person board for enforcing and regulating shipments. And the Vice Admiralty Court Act disallowed smugglers the right to be tried in colonial courts, and instead they had to be tried in Royal Navy courts. So these Townshend Acts were basically more examples of how the king and parliament restricted colonial rights and limited their political freedom. Alrighty. Next is the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. So, as the colonists became more and more enraged at the mistreatment, they began to take action and rebelled in different ways. Boston was kind of the hub and the spot for the most notable colonial rebellions, like I said, the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. So, these next two slides really accentuate the revolts and the impact they had toward the start of the American Revolution in general. So, first is the Boston Massacre of 1770. It was a revolt by the Bostonians who attacked unwelcome British soldiers, causing them to fire into the mob, and it ended in multiple deaths and findings of two British soldiers guilty of manslaughter. Obviously, the sort of violence struck many colonists by surprise and only caused them to become more displeased at the British control. These protests of taxation without representation continued with the Boston Tea Party in 1773, where colonists hurled in 340 boxes of tea into the Boston Harbor. When the British failed to accurately identify and prosecute these individuals involved, Parliament enforced yet another legislation called the Intolerable Acts. These acts were more intense and they were implied to punish, compensate, intensify British control, and place more requirements on the colonists, including the requirement to house British soldiers. At this point in time, the colonists are completely over the mistreatment and unfair policies the king has placed on their lives and are ready to take action. As a first form of action, the Continental Congresses, the first occurring on September 5th, 1774, and the second occurring on May 10th, 1775. These congresses were held to discuss between the delegates of each colony to draft petitions to the king. So after the Intolerable Acts, the First Continental Congress sort of discussed the Sons of Liberty's call for a boycott, and came up with the Articles of Association. These articles basically said that if the Intolerable Acts were not repealed, the boycotts will take place. The delegates also drafted a formal letter to the king to request a peaceful approach to the de-escalation of enforcement on the colonies by the British soldiers before anything radical occurred. When Congress failed to get an adequate response from the king, a Second Continental Congress took place as violence began to spark. In this Congress, the Continental Army was formed and George Washington was appointed general, and they prepared for war. As a last resort to peace, the delegates drafted the Olive Branch Petition as sort of the final attempt to avoid war and sent it back to the king. Obviously, the petition failed and violence broke out. At the first sight of the American Revolution, the battle at Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. Before the battle, the royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Gage, expressed a fear of colonial rebellion and set out to seize the weapons and powder in Concord. That's where the famous Paul Revere rode out to warn the militia that the British regulars were on the way. Shortly after, the battle began and the American Revolution emerged. So, to briefly conclude, the American Revolution began due to a various amount of reasons. The colonists were pretty much fed up with the overwhelming presence of British soldiers in their colonies and the unfair tax that Parliament imposed to help fund the Seven Years' War. They grew impatient with the ignorance of the king and the ability to restore peace and allow independence among the colonies. They remained fairly civil until they really couldn't do anything more about it and things were getting out of hand. So, by the direction of George Washington, the colonies fought hard for 8 years and finally gained the independence that they wanted from the king. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a good day.